My wife had been gone for 14 months when a letter arrived at our door addressed to her. I was standing in the hallway of our home in Hamilton, Ontario, sorting through the usual stack of flyers and bills, when I saw her name printed neatly on a white envelope, Margaret Ann Calloway. Not a sympathy card, not something forwarded from before her passing. This was dated 3 weeks ago. The return address in the top left corner read Barton and Finch Legal Services, Toronto, On. I had never heard of this firm in 41 years of marriage. My hands went still. Margaret had passed from what her doctors called complications arising from a long-standing heart condition. She was 63 years old, and the last 8 months of her life had been a slow, painful decline that I had watched helplessly from beside her hospital bed, beside her recliner at home, beside every place she rested while her body quietly gave up. We had said our goodbyes properly. We had cried together, laughed about old memories, made sure our daughter knew where every important document was kept. So why was a law firm in Toronto writing to my dead wife? I set the rest of the mail on the console table and turned the envelope over. It was sealed. I stood there for a long moment in that quiet hallway, the January cold pressing against the front windows, the furnace ticking somewhere below. I thought about setting it aside, calling the firm to explain the mistake, tossing it in the recycling. Instead, I opened it. The letter inside was brief and professional. It referenced a confidential account opened in Margaret's name and indicated that correspondence had gone unanswered for several months. It asked that she, or an authorized representative, contact the office at her earliest convenience regarding matters pertaining to Estate File 2-291 CM. There was a direct extension and a lawyer's name, J. Finch. I read it 3 times before the cold settled into my chest. Margaret had never mentioned any account with any law firm. We handled our finances together, always had. Joint checking, joint savings, her RRSP, my pension from 30 years with the city. I knew every dollar we had and where it came from. There was no file, there was no account. And yet here was a letter with her name on it, from a real address, on Bay Street, referencing something I had never heard of. Please subscribe to our channel and share what city you're watching from, because what I found when I called that number would turn everything I believed about my marriage inside out. I called Jay Finch the following morning. His assistant confirmed that he could not discuss the account without either the account holder or proof of estate authority. I drove to our family solicitor's office on King Street that same afternoon and left 2 hours later with a copy of Margaret's will and the letter's probate that named me executor of her estate. I called Barton and Finch again the next day, faxed the documents, and waited. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Jay Finch himself in a small, carpeted office overlooking King Street West. He was a precise man in his late 50s, the kind of lawyer who chose every word deliberately. He showed me the file. An account had been opened in Margaret's name 11 months before her death. Not a savings account, not an investment account. A trust. The trust held a life insurance policy taken out through a private broker with a benefit of $450,000. The monthly premiums had been drawn from an account I had never seen. The original named beneficiary was Margaret herself. But 6 weeks after her death, someone had filed paperwork to redirect the entire benefit to a numbered company registered in Ontario. The signing authority on that company was a single name. My brother-in-law, Derek. I sat in that office chair and said nothing for what felt like a full minute. The lawyer watched me with careful eyes. Derek was Margaret's younger brother. He had been a presence in our lives for as long as I could remember. The kind of man who showed up for holidays and birthdays and made everyone laugh, and then disappeared for months at a time. He had struggled with money most of his adult life, a series of small businesses that never quite worked out. Debts he mentioned vaguely and never explained. In the final year of Margaret's illness, he had been around more than usual, helping with errands, driving her to appointments in Toronto when I couldn't take time off work, bringing over supplements and herbal teas he insisted were good for her heart. He had seemed, for the first time in years, like a genuinely devoted brother. I had been grateful to him. I thanked Jay Finch and walked out into the gray January afternoon with the file copied and tucked under my arm. I did not call Derek. I drove home, made a pot of tea I did not drink, and sat at the kitchen table until it was dark outside. My daughter called at 7:30. She lived 20 minutes away in Ancaster with her husband and their son, who was 12 and obsessed with hockey. When I answered, She could hear something in my voice immediately. "Dad, what's wrong?" I told her I had received some confusing paperwork regarding her mother's estate and that I was sorting it out. I kept my voice even. She asked twice if she should come over. I said no, and that I would explain soon, which was not quite the truth, but not quite a lie. After I hung up, I thought about Derek bringing those supplements. Week after week, a different combination: hawthorn berry, CoQ10, something he called a cardiac support blend he ordered online. Margaret had taken them without question because Derek was family and because when you are frightened and sick, you reach for anything that feels like hope. Her cardiologist at Hamilton General had been aware she was taking supplements and had noted it in her file without alarm. I did not sleep that night. 2 days later, my daughter showed up at my door at 9 in the morning without calling ahead. I knew from her face that something had changed. She had that look she gets when she has been holding something back for too long and it has finally become impossible. She sat down at the same kitchen table and wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee and told me she had been worrying about something for several months but had not said anything because she did not want to upset me while I was still grieving. Then she told me about the woman. She had seen Derek at Limmeridge Mall in October, 4 months after Margaret's funeral. He was with a woman she did not recognize, and the way they were together was not how you were with a friend or a colleague. She had almost approached him, and then stopped because something about the scene felt wrong in a way she could not name. The woman was perhaps 40, dark-haired, well-dressed. They had not seen her. She had mentioned it to her husband, who told her it was probably nothing. She had tried to believe that. But then, at Christmas, Derek had arrived at our family dinner with a story about a new business venture he was excited about. Something to do with property investments, and he had been vague in the way he always was when he was hiding the scale of something. And he had drunk too much and laughed too loudly and left early. I looked at my daughter across the table and made a decision. I told her about the letter. I told her about Jay Finch. I told her about the trust and the insurance policy and the numbered company and her uncle's name on the signing authority. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "Uncle Derek was the one handling Mom's supplements." Neither of us said what we were both thinking. Not yet. I called a detective with Hamilton Police Services the following week. I had spent those intervening days collecting what I could. I had submitted a formal information request through the estate to get copies of every transaction associated with Margaret's medical expenses over the 2 years before her death. I had found 3 payments, roughly $400 each, categorized as health products, drawn from a joint account. I had never examined closely because Margaret had managed our household bills during her illness, and I had trusted her completely and felt guilty examining her work now that she was gone. The detective's name was Sergeant Okafor. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s who listened without interrupting and took notes in a small spiral book. When I finished laying out everything I had found, she looked at me steadily and said she would need some time to look into it. She called me 48 hours later and asked me to come in. I sat across from Sergeant Okafor in a small interview room at the Central Station on King William Street. She had a folder open on the table between us. She told me that they had looked into the insurance policy and confirmed the beneficiary change had been made using a digital signature 6 weeks after Margaret's death. She told me that the numbered company Derek controlled had received the full benefit payout, $450,000, before anyone had flagged the policy as potentially fraudulent. Then she told me that an anonymous tip had come in 2 days earlier. The tip alleged that Margaret had not died of natural causes. It further alleged that I had known about my wife's cardiac condition and had obtained supplements that accelerated her decline in order to collect on a life insurance policy I had taken out without her knowledge. The words landed like something physical. Sergeant Okafor watched my face carefully as she said them. She was not unkind, but she was precise. "Mr. Calloway, I want you to understand that we are obligated to follow every credible lead. At this point in the investigation, you are what we call a person of interest. I'd strongly recommend consulting with a lawyer before we speak further." I drove home in a kind of daze. The gray February sky pressed down on the highway, and I kept my hands on the wheel and thought about the fact that someone had called in a tip pointing at me. Not pointing at Derek, at me. Whoever had set this up had planned far enough ahead to plan for a fallback. My daughter was waiting at my house when I arrived. I told her what Sergeant Okafor had said. She went quiet in the way she does when she is frightened and trying to appear calm for my sake. Then she sat down and said, "Dad, We have to figure out who that woman was. We spent the next week being careful and quiet. My daughter contacted Margaret's cardiologist at Hamilton General and, after explaining the circumstances, obtained a second opinion review of her mother's final records from an independent specialist in Toronto. The specialist called us back in 4 days. She was professional, but her voice had an edge of gravity that told me she had found something before she said a word. The combination of symptoms Margaret presented in her final 6 months, the irregular heartbeat, the vision disturbances, the increasing weakness that her cardiologist had attributed to the progression of her condition, was consistent with chronic low-dose digitalis toxicity. Digitalis is a compound derived from the foxglove plant, and in small, repeated doses is virtually indistinguishable from natural cardiac deterioration. It would not have flagged on a standard tox screen at the time of death. A targeted retest of preserved tissue samples would be necessary to confirm. She asked if we wanted her to file the request. We said yes. 3 days later, my daughter found the woman. She had gone back to the mall and spoken to a manager at a clothing boutique near where she had seen them together. She described Derek and the woman. The manager recognized the woman and knew her name because she was a regular customer. Her name was Colette, and she had a business card in a holder near the register. She was a certified nutritional consultant who operated out of an office on Upper James Street. A nutritional consultant. I thought about all those supplements, all those carefully labeled bottles Derek brought to our home, the ones he said he had researched specifically for Margaret's condition. I thought about my wife trusting her brother. I thought about her drinking hawthorn berry tea at the kitchen table and telling me she actually felt it was helping. I did not sleep again that night. On a Thursday morning in late February, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It read, "You don't want to keep pulling on this thread. Think about your grandson. Some things are better left alone." I sat in the kitchen holding my phone and read the message 4 times. My grandson. He was 12 years old and played defense and collected hockey cards and called me Grandpa Hal and had cried at Margaret's funeral in the way children cry when they understand something has changed forever, but not quite yet the full weight of what it means. I forwarded the message to Sergeant Okafor immediately. Then I called my daughter. Then I called her husband and told him to keep his son close for the next few days without explaining the full reason why. That evening, Sergeant Okafor called me back. She told me that the tissue sample results had come in. Digitalis compounds consistent with chronic ingestion had been confirmed in Margaret's preserved pathology samples. She was now treating the case as a suspected homicide. She said the threatening text gave them grounds for an emergency warrant on the numbered company's financial records and on Colette's business operations. She also told me that Derek had a cottage near Penetanguishene on Georgian Bay that he rarely spoke about and that they had reason to believe he was using it to meet with Colette outside of Hamilton. I told Sergeant Okafor everything, the supplements, the mall, the business card, the timeline of Derek's increased presence in our home during Margaret's illness. She listened and said that she needed me to do something difficult. She needed me to contact Derek and tell him that I had found something in Margaret's estate papers and that I needed to speak with him privately. She needed me to ask him to meet me. I told her I could do that. I called Derek the next morning. My voice was steady because I had rehearsed it the night before, and because 40 years of marriage to a woman you love teaches you that some things are worth holding yourself together for. He answered on the 3rd ring, cautious but composed. I told him I had been going through Margaret's files and had found something confusing related to an insurance matter and that I would rather talk face-to-face than on the phone. I said I wasn't sure what to make of it. He was quiet for a moment and then suggested we meet at the cottage. He said it would be more private than either of our homes. I said that sounded fine. I gave the address to Sergeant Okafor that afternoon. I drove north on a Saturday in early March, the highway giving way to the 2-lane roads of cottage country. The Georgian Bay landscape still caught in the gray end of winter, birch trees bare and white against a colorless sky. I found the cottage at the end of a gravel lane through second-growth forest. Derek's truck was there. So was another vehicle, a dark blue SUV I did not recognize. I parked and walked toward the front door. The property was isolated and quiet in the way cottage properties always are in off-season. No neighbors visible, no traffic, just the sound of wind off the bay somewhere beyond the tree line. The door opened before I reached it. Derek was standing in the doorway, and his face was doing something complicated when he saw me. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, something that lived between the two. "Hal," he said, "come in." The interior was small and cluttered, a wood stove in the corner, fishing gear stacked against one wall, a folding table with 2 chairs. Colette was sitting in one of those chairs. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they have already made a decision about. Derek closed the door. I told him I had found the trust account. I told him I had spoken with Jay Finch. I watched his face shift through several expressions in quick succession before it settled into something cold and still. He said, "Hal, I think you need to understand something about Margaret." I said, "Tell me." And then he did. Because people like Derek, people who believe they are smarter than everyone around them, cannot resist explaining. He told me that Margaret had known her condition was terminal long before the doctors made it official. He said she had come to him and that together they had made a plan. He said the insurance policy had been her idea and that she had wanted to make sure he was taken care of because she felt guilty for years of borrowing money from him that our family never knew about. Every sentence was smooth and rehearsed and almost believable. Then Colette spoke. She said that Margaret had been confused toward the end and that I was misreading a private family arrangement as something sinister. She said it calmly, the way someone speaks when they have practiced the calm. I looked at Derek and said, "Were the foxglove extracts part of the plan too?" The room went very quiet. Derek's expression changed completely. The rehearsed calm collapsed into something harder and uglier. He took a step toward me and his voice dropped to something I had not heard before, something that did not belong to the brother-in-law I thought I knew. He said, "You should have left it alone, Hal. I tried to warn you." Colette stood up. She reached toward the shelf beside her, and I understood then that I had perhaps misjudged how dangerous the next 30 seconds could become. The door came open behind me. Sergeant Okafor stepped through it, followed by 2 OPP officers who had been positioned at the back of the property since before I arrived. She identified herself, stated that she was placing both of them under arrest, and named the charges in a clear, level voice while one of the officers moved to stand between Colette and whatever she had been reaching for. Derek looked at me. He did not look like my brother-in-law anymore. He looked like a stranger who had been wearing that face for years. I stepped outside into the cold March air and breathed. My daughter was there. She had insisted on coming as far as the end of the lane, and Sergeant Okafor had allowed it. She crossed the frozen gravel and put her arms around me, and we stood there while the police did what police do. And I thought about Margaret in her final months, tired and patient and trusting, taking the capsules her brother brought because she believed he loved her. She had deserved so much better than that. The trial took place in Ontario Superior Court of Justice 15 months later. The Crown Attorney had built the case on 4 pillars: the pathology results confirming chronic digitalis poisoning, the fraudulent insurance trust and illegal beneficiary change, the financial records showing Colette had been paid from the numbered company's account for 18 months before Margaret's death, and the recorded conversation from the cottage in which Derek had confirmed his knowledge of the supplements. Derek's defense argued diminished responsibility and claimed that Colette had orchestrated everything and manipulated him. Colette's defense argued the reverse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The sentence for Derek was life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 12 years, the minimum for second-degree murder under the Criminal Code of Canada, plus 16 years consecutive for fraud over $5,000 and breach of trust. Colette received 14 years for her role in the conspiracy. The numbered company's assets, including what remained of the insurance payout, were seized by the Crown and directed toward restitution through the estate. I gave a victim impact statement before sentencing. I stood in that courtroom with my daughter beside me and my son-in-law and my grandson in the gallery, and I looked at the man who had sat at our Christmas table and driven my wife to her appointments and smiled at me across our kitchen and said what needed to be said. I told the court that Margaret was a woman who had volunteered at the food bank on Barton Street for 11 years, who had hand-knit scarves for every teacher at her grandson's school, who had never in 41 years of marriage given me reason to doubt her. I told them that her final months had been stolen from her by someone she trusted completely, that every good day she thought she was having was manufactured, that the gentleness she showed toward Derek in those months was the gentleness of a woman who had no idea he was slowly ending her life. I told the court that no sentence could give back what had been taken, but I told them that Margaret had believed in the idea that truth, pursued with patience and love, eventually came to light. She had believed that enough times and in enough circumstances that it had become one of the quiet foundations of how we built our life together. Standing there, I believed it too. 18 months after the verdict, I am sitting on the back porch of our house in Hamilton on a warm September evening, watching my grandson practice his wrist shot in the backyard. He is taller now, and his shot is sharper, and he has the focused quiet of a boy who has grown up faster than anyone wanted him to. He knows what happened to his grandmother. We told him honestly, at an age and in a way he could carry without being crushed by it. My daughter sits beside me with a cup of tea, and we watch him for a while without needing to say anything. She asks, eventually, whether I think about what might have happened if I had just set that letter aside, if I had assumed it was a clerical error, something forwarded by mistake, and dropped it in the blue bin and never called J. Finch. I think about that sometimes, I tell her, and I understand why the question feels important, because the truth cost us things. It cost us the version of grief we were allowed to have when we thought Margaret's death was only sad and not criminal. It cost us the uncomplicated memory of a man who sat at our table for years. It cost my grandson something he should not have had to know at 12. But I think about Margaret taking those capsules and believing they were helping her. I think about her thanking her brother. I think about her dying without knowing that the person she trusted most in her final months was the reason her final months were so hard. She deserved the truth, even if we were the only ones left to find it for her. My grandson comes up onto the porch and drops into the chair beside me, flushed from shooting drills, and asks if I want to watch the Leafs game with him after dinner. I tell him absolutely yes, and he grins at me with something that is entirely his grandmother's grin. The specific quality of it, the ease of it, and for a moment I can hardly breathe. But then I can. And I do. We have learned a few things that I want to share with you, because if this story has found its way to you, then perhaps some part of it speaks to something you have carried or witnessed or feared in your own life. The first is this. When something feels wrong, trust that feeling, even when every reasonable voice tells you to leave it alone. I almost set that letter aside. I almost let it go. The most important step I took was the smallest one, picking up the phone. The second is this. Grief makes us vulnerable, and the people who would exploit that vulnerability count on us being too exhausted and too heartbroken to look closely. Look closely anyway, not from suspicion but from love. Margaret deserved someone looking closely on her behalf. And the third is this. Families built on honesty are harder to build and harder to maintain than families built on comfortable silence. But they are the only ones that hold when everything else comes apart. My daughter and I know things now that we wish we did not know. But we know them together, and we face them together. And that is the only foundation worth building on. The Leafs game starts in an hour. My grandson is already arguing about line combinations, which is his grandmother's stubbornness wearing a hockey jersey. I'm going to pour myself a coffee and sit beside him on the couch and let the evening be simple for a while. Some evenings, that is the bravest thing there is. If you have been through something like this, a betrayal from within your own family, a loss that turned out to carry secrets you were never meant to find, I would love to hear your story in the comments. And please subscribe to fr-sweetrevenge for more true stories about the courage it takes to keep going and keep believing when the people closest to us turn out to be strangers.